Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. In the ongoing debate around trans rights, the Supreme Court has ruled that in law, the term woman refers to biological sex. So what happens now? There have been years of legal wrangling, ending with the highest court in the UK ruling that the term woman hinges on biological sex. But the judgment came with caution from Lord Hodge.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not.
The campaigners who brought this case, well, let's just say they didn't exactly see it that way.
Oh, it's absolutely a victory for women's rights. This case was always about women, never about trans rights, who, as Judge Hodge said, that they are fully protected in law still.
Now, that was Trina Budge from the campaign group For Women Scotland. They brought the case. They say this was never about removing rights from trans people. Instead, about preserving rights for women.
It means there's absolute clarity in law regarding what a woman is. We know for sure now that we are referring to the biological sex class of women, and that when we see a women-only space, it means exactly that. Just women, no men, not even if they have a gender recognition certificate.
But despite Lord Hodge's insistence that there are no victors today, trans campaigners certainly feel like they're on the losing side. Here's Vic Valentine from Scottish Trans.
It pretty much changes the way that governments and equalities bodies have thought the Gender Recognition Act works for 20 years. And the Gender Recognition Act was all about providing a way for trans men and women to be recognised as who they truly are. And this judgment seems to have really restricted the times when that will actually be the case. And yeah, that's incredibly disappointing. The big things that seems to be missing today, though, is that for trans people, what really matters to us is that we are seen, understood and recognised as who we know we are, and not the sex originally recorded on our birth certificate. And this judgment seems to have taken away a lot of the circumstances where we will be seen that way.
So, in one of the most divisive debates of our times, what changes now in culture, in society, and of course in law? Legal commentator Joshua Rosenberg is on the Daily. Joshua, remind us, what exactly was it that the Supreme Court was asked to rule on, and why?
As a matter of law, the question was, what does the word man, the word woman, the word sex mean in the Equality Act 2010? That's the Act of Parliament that consolidated the equality laws.
So what is the context behind this ruling?
As a matter of history, what this was all about is something fairly obscure. The idea was that Scottish ministers wanted to increase the proportion of women on public boards in Scotland. And the question was, well, who counts as a woman for this proposal? And originally they said it includes anybody with a gender recognition certificate certifying them as a woman, and that was challenged by this group For Women Scotland, and they of course have won in the Supreme Court today.
Just briefly explain a gender recognition certificate.
That is a document that you can get under the legislation that recognised people changing their gender, and it's quite a powerful document because it retrospectively changes your birth certificate. The thinking was that these people have undergone surgery in many cases, although that's not essential, and they wish to live a life in their new gender, and in certain circumstances they might need to prove this. And if they get a certificate, it's not a document you actually show to somebody, because the whole point of it is that you don't want anybody to know that you've changed your gender. But it does mean you can get your birth certificate changed and therefore show that you were born in the gender, sex if you like, that you wanted to be born in but were not. It changes the way in which you were registered at birth.
Certainly all sides at the Supreme Court were looking for clarity as to what it means to be a woman in the eyes of the law. We certainly got some clarity, didn't we?
We certainly did. And the reason that there were concerns about clarity is that when this case was before the Scottish courts, there wasn't the clarity that was wanted. Indeed, there was what some people have called a bit of a fudge, because obviously the Equality Act talks about discrimination in certain circumstances. So the Inner House of the Court of Session in Edinburgh seemed to suggest that these words, sex and women and so on, could bear a variable meaning, so that the provisions relating to pregnancy and maternity refer to biological sex only, whereas elsewhere it refers to what's called certificated sex as well. In other words, that you've got a gender recognition certificate.
So in essence, the Supreme Court arrived at this decision that for the purposes of definition, it comes down to biology. They arrived at that because if it had not been the case, then the law would have been a bit of a mess.
That's right. But the way they did it was by statutory interpretation. They looked at the Equality Act 2010 and tried to work out what Parliament meant. But as you say, they pointed out that if the opposite decision had been reached, it would have led to confusion because you can't discriminate against somebody on the grounds of their acquiring a new gender. You can't discriminate against trans people. But what this would mean would be that somebody with a gender recognition certificate would have additional rights, which somebody without a gender recognition certificate would not. And yet that person might have transitioned, but the person who has to give them the rights that they're seeking wouldn't know whether they had a certificate or not, because they're not allowed to ask them. So that would have led to great confusion. And what the court said was that this was clearly not what Parliament intended. Of course, if Parliament wants to change the law, Parliament can do so. But that was a question of interpreting what Parliament meant.
I don't know if you, like me, were struck with the tone that the Supreme Court wished to adopt in handing down this judgment, particularly when it came to the notion that this was a defeat for the trans community.
Yes, it is a defeat for the trans community because they were certainly on the other side. But you're absolutely right. Lord Hodge went to enormous lengths to say that this was not a defeat for the trans community in the sense that they were not to be left unprotected. And that's crucial. They are protected by the Equality Act just as women are protected by the Equality Act. The court said that this interpretation does not remove protection from trans people with or without a gender recognition certificate. Trans people are protected from discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment. They're also able to invoke provisions on direct discrimination and harassment and indirect discrimination on the basis of sex, a certificated sex reading, in other words, what the trans community were asking for, is not required to give this protection. So yes, it was not the outcome they wanted, and the reaction I've seen from one or two representatives is, hang on a moment, read the thing carefully. It may not be as bad as it looks. The fact that the other side are celebrating, and they are, doesn't mean that you should be crying into your beer.
So what then are the practical consequences of recognition in law that a woman is a biological woman?
In some ways, I think this just represents a legal recognition of what most people would think, most people would expect, and what very many people, I think, would want. Even the question of whether women can be represented on the boards of Scottish public bodies, an admirable aim in itself, is not actually overturned by this decision. There is nothing to stop the Scottish government pressing ahead with its aim to rebalance these public bodies in Scotland. It's simply that this is not a judgment which will allow trans people to claim the rights which some of them have been seeking.
What, though, of single-sex spaces? Are there practical consequences that may flow, or are we just going to have to wait, I presume, for another set of court cases? But first, in my mind, of course, and it has particular resonance to those who've been following Scottish news, I mean, Scottish prisons. Will women's prisons still have to accept trans women in Scotland?
Well, that is a difficult question. It's obviously a question for the Scottish Prison Service, ultimately for the Scottish Government. But the way in which this judgment is worded suggests to me that a trans woman who wants to be in a woman's prison, somebody we're talking about who was born male, somebody who might not have had any gender reassignment surgery, I think that person is going to find it more difficult to insist on being housed in a prison which is confined to the sex or gender which that person has adopted and is living in. There's nothing in this judgment which would help somebody in that position. It doesn't say it's illegal. It doesn't say that you can't do it. But I don't think it's going to help anybody bring a legal claim. And it does seem to me to send a message that it is possible to have single-sex organizations, single-sex groups, because the court referred specifically in its interpretation of the Equality Act to single-sex services, including changing rooms, hostels and medical services, communal accommodation, single-sex higher education institutions, and so on. It referred to women's fair participation in sport and the operation of the public sector equality duty and the armed forces. Now, these are all organizations or associations which have had difficulty with people who appear to be men presenting themselves and wishing to take part in spaces or events reserved for women. And I don't think that that is going to be any easier for them as a result of this ruling.
Okay, Joshua, what do you make of the argument that I have seen from some trans activists, some trans allies, that trans people are now in essence of two sexes, the sex that they had at birth and the sex to which they have changed?
I don't think that's a particularly persuasive argument. If you have changed your gender, either through surgery or without surgery, and you have obtained a certificate recognizing your new gender, then the law recognizes you as a member of that gender for all purposes. The question, however, is can you turn up at these single-sex spaces on the grounds that you have this certificate? Well, you can try, and you don't have to show the certificate. In fact, nobody can ask to see the certificate because the whole point of it is that it's a private matter, and you may be challenged, and it's then up to these bodies to decide which you are, whether you're male or female. The only thing is you can't insist on being able to join a single-sex organization or grouping or whatever it is simply by saying, well, I've got a certificate, still less by saying, well, I identify as the sex of the group that I want to join.
Am I to read much into the fact that this was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court, but one which overturned the decision made by the Scottish courts? I mean, did the Scottish courts just get this completely wrong then?
The way our courts work is that the highest court has the last word. Now, that doesn't always mean they get it right, but if they're final, that's the law. So yes, the Scottish courts were overturned, but it's worth bearing in mind that the President and the Deputy President of the Supreme Court, Lord Reid and Lord Hodge, are both former members of the Court of Session in Edinburgh. They're both brought up in the Scottish legal system. The next judge to sit was Lord Lloyd-Jones, who's Welsh, and then there were the two female members of the Supreme Court who were sitting. So the court went to considerable length to ensure that nobody could say that it was biased against Scotland or biased against women, and the fact that they were unanimous and produced the result, and it's a lengthy judgment, it's 88 pages, and they produced the result within 4 months, which is actually quite quick by the standards of a complicated judgment like this. I think it is a very clear judgment, and the Scottish courts were simply overturned. That's how it is.
Can I just be absolutely clear? My understanding was that there were already protections at law for some single-sex spaces. If that's the case, has all the Supreme Court done today, in essence, is it just a clarification of where we already were?
Yes, in the sense that they have dismissed the suggestion that these single-sex spaces were open to people with gender recognition certificates. Now, to be fair, this wasn't exactly what the case was originally about. It wasn't about single-sex spaces. It was about representation on public boards.
Of course.
But yes, the argument was, well, if these people are entitled to representation on public boards, maybe they're entitled to turn up in single-sex spaces. Well, that argument has firmly been knocked away. And what the Supreme Court has done is to endorse what they think Parliament intended and what I think many people thought Parliament intended. So in that sense, it's not an extraordinary thing. I mean, they haven't gone out of their way to say this is what a woman is, this is what sex means, this is what gender means. All they have done is to interpret how those terms are referred to or are meant to be understood in the Equality Act. The answer is that man, woman and sex refer to biological sex.
Following the decision of the Supreme Court this morning, part the morality, part the ethics, but if someone says trans women are women, then legally, at the very least, that is incorrect.
They can say it, and nobody is blocking their right to free speech. But the question is what that utterance actually means. Does it mean that they can get a new passport, a new driving license, that they can pass as women, whatever else they wish to do? Yes. Does that mean that they can insist on taking part in single-sex sports and turning up at single-sex spaces and things like that? I would say no.
Joshua Rosenberg, thanks very much.
Thank you.
For more analysis of what the judgment means, just head over to skynews.com. The Daily is back again tomorrow.